Siempre Cuba ha estado luchando por su libertad.
Murieron 100.000 personas. No pudo triunfar, pero cambió el país.
There is little question that Meyer Lansky had thoroughly corrupted Batista.
It's not a lie. They didn't promise anything. They promised a revolution. They did a revolution.
Эти ребята обязательно будут либо мучениками, либо национальными героями.
Fidel Castro.
And he told Khrushchev, you should unleash the entire Soviet nuclear arsenals. Apocalypse.
Kuba lässt sich nicht in die Knie zwingen.
Today, the island of Cuba is one of the last outposts of socialism in the world. But immediately after Fidel Castro's revolution, this was by no means predictable. During his struggle against the dictatorial regime of Fulgencio Batista, Castro expressly claimed not to be a communist. It was not hammer and sickle he had fought for, but to finally free his homeland from all outside influence. So why did he authorize the presence of 43,000 Soviet soldiers on the island? How did the United States embargo begin, still in place today? And how did Castro's friend, Che Guevara, come to die alone and abandoned in the mountains of Bolivia? Fidel Castro embodied the age-old dream of a free and independent island, a dream the Cubans have pursued for centuries.
Cuba llegó atrasada a la independencia comparado con el resto de los demás países de América Latina. Después logró invertir un proceso y en menos de un siglo, casi en 80 años, desarrolló 4 procesos revolucionarios muy intensos como prácticamente no lo hizo ningún país de América Latina.
Man muss bei der Unabhängigkeit eines hinzufügen. Sie waren unabhängig, aber nur von den USA. Dieser wirklich historische Befreiungsakt am 1. Januar 1959 ist ihnen gelungen, bis heute.
Cuba only became an independent country in 1902 and immediately fell under the influence of the United States. The two countries are just 90 miles apart. Cuba's exports, mainly sugar, headed for the American continent. In exchange, American companies built up the island's infrastructure and controlled its economy. No Cuban politicians dared to break with the U.S. until Fidel Castro began expropriating American companies in 1960. And even though Castro kept repeating that he was not a communist, his policies became increasingly radical.
Diese Radikalisierung haben so ganz wenige erwartet. Und das war, glaube ich, auch ein Grund, warum Fidel Castro überhaupt Erfolg haben konnte, weil die alten Oberschichten gar nicht das befürchtet hatten, was dann passierte. Die haben nicht damit gerechnet, dass es zum Bruch mit den USA kommt.
The American government reacted by restricting sugar imports from Cuba. It was a serious blow to Castro's economy. Thousands of Cubans sought exile, most in the United States. Castro's government, meanwhile, had to look for new trade partners. In February 1960, Anastas Mikoyan, a member of the Soviet Politburo, visited the island. It was the beginning of Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union.
Постепенно, не в один день, все их взгляды созрели, и отношения не в один день сложились с Советским Союзом. Постепенно у них другого выхода не было, потому что без поддержки Советского Союза они трудно было там установить самостоятельные государства.
Fidel's brother Raul and iconic revolutionary Che Guevara were both in favor of closer ties with Moscow. Ernesto Che Guevara was from Argentina and believed in the socialist world revolution. He wanted to make Cuba a tropical model state for communism and then export this communism, especially to the Third World. Fidel Castro appointed him Minister of Industry and head of the central bank. Guevara's qualifications, he had written about communist economic theories before. He was one of many improvised ministers in Fidel's government.
Che es el único tipo que realmente era comunista en Cuba, de todos los dirigentes.
And he looked at me and said, "You know how I became president of the National Bank?" I said, "I have no idea." He said, "One time I was sitting in a meeting where Fidel was, and he asked for a dedicated communist, I thought, and I raised my hand. And he was asking for a dedicated economist."
Che Guevara compensated for his lack of knowledge with revolutionary zeal and commitment. As Minister of Industry, he was known for often working 16 hours a day. He allowed cameras to film him as he toured Cuba's fields and factories, always hoping to inspire the people to work hard.
He was intelligent, very intelligent. He taught Fidel a lot of things. Fidel depended on him. Fidel wanted him to take over the Bank of Cuba. He said, "You have to sign our new money." And that's when he signed CHE on every Cuban. He said, that's enough of my banking.
A mí no me caía bien personalmente, porque me parecía que como argentino, en fin, era muy arrogante. Pero realmente era el único tipo de verdad revolucionario en toda esa gente.
The Soviet Union provided Cuba with a loan and other economic support. This helped the island's economy to get back on track. But the alliance with Moscow was cause for concern, both among Cuban exiles and the U.S. government. Newly inaugurated U.S. President John F. Kennedy had inherited a planned military operation to topple Castro's regime from his predecessor, and now had to decide whether to implement it.
The Bay of Pigs was going to be an attempt to land a number of Cubans into a place in Cuba and then call upon the Organization of American States, use American troops, and intervene. This was the original Eisenhower program. As it evolved when Kennedy took over, which was that same year and end of 1960, Kennedy didn't want the U.S. involvement, didn't want to send the U.S. Navy, so he said, well, let the 1,200 Cubans fight it out.
After Kennedy gave his go-ahead, 1,334 heavily armed Cuban exiles landed on Cuba's south coast. But the Bay of Pigs invasion failed and united Cubans behind Fidel Castro. The state-controlled media used the occasion to vaunt Castro's merits as the defender of national independence. Relations with the United States seemed irreparably damaged, and Fidel Castro declared himself and Cuba to be socialist.
Indudablemente la mayoría confiaba en este líder, en este mesías que se llamaba Fidel Castro, que había surgido y que traía esta revolución, donde incluso cuando planteaba de construir el socialismo en Cuba, era creído y seguido por mucha gente.
Aquel triunfo de Girón se vio que sí se podía, que sí la revolución tenía posibilidad, y por supuesto que el enemigo no se cruzó de brazos, siguió preparándose, atacándonos, etcétera, etcétera.
After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the CIA changed its strategy. They now planned to assassinate Fidel Castro. To carry out this plan, they contacted several leading U.S. mafia figures. These men had lost their lucrative casinos in Havana through Castro's revolution.
They went to mafia figures to try to kill Castro. The reality is classic mafia. They took the government's money, but didn't try to kill him.
Some of them were working with him as counter or double agents. They were hoping by working with him they would get their casinos back. It didn't work. You don't succeed that way with Fidel Castro.
After failing to enlist the mafia to kill Fidel Castro, the CIA turned to Cuban exiles. Many of them had lost everything when they fled Cuba after Castro took power on the island, and the CIA, as well as the White House, were growing desperate.
The Kennedy administration was very much focused on getting rid of Castro, but they also didn't want to go to war over it. They did not want to start a world war, so the idea was to do things such as what happened at the Bay of Pigs, having small groups go in and invade, having the CIA try to poison Castro.
During this time, Fidel Castro lived well guarded in Havana's Hilton Hotel. Having failed with all other plans before, the CIA now tried to enlist Marita Lorenz, who had had a love affair with Castro shortly after he took power. If Castro's death came at the hands of a scorned former lover, they reasoned, it could not possibly be traced back to Washington.
They said, I'm the only one that has the keys to Fidel's suite, the uniform. He said, would you go back? Can you go back? Will he accept you? I said, of course, yes. I didn't do anything bad to him. And they said, would you go back and put these pills in his food?
In February 1961, Marita Lorenz returned to Cuba. In her possession were the CIA's poison pills. Her CIA handlers waited in the lobby as Fidel's bodyguards accompanied Marita to his suite.
Before I saw Fidel, I was so nervous being caught with the capsules. I put them in cold cream jar ponds, and I put them out in a bidet. And they went down and down and down and down, slowly but surely. I felt guilty having them on me. If Fidel caught me with the pills, I could get killed. He said, did you come back down to kill me? I said, yes. He said, here, kill me. There's my gun here. He gave me the gun. It was hanging over the lamp, 45. I said, no, I can't kill you. You didn't do anything to me. Why should I kill you? Yours is not my life to take. And then we just hugged, made love, and I started crying, mostly out of fear because I didn't know what to do, whether to beg him to stay or whether to run for it. The CIA guys were downstairs in the lobby. When I was upstairs, they thought I was killing Fidel, and they were downstairs reading their newspaper. And I saw them, I went past them, and I was still crying like that. And they thought I was crying because I killed them, but I was crying because I was afraid of them. And I got on a Cubana airline and went home.
Marita Lorenz returned to the United States, and thus another covert CIA operation against Fidel Castro had failed. It had began with the debacle of the Bay of Pigs landing. Since then, it seemed that no matter what the CIA tried to topple him, it only served to strengthen his position further. The Cuban Secret Services became more efficient, repelling each attack, and every minor victory was fully exploited by Castro's propaganda machine.
The Kennedys failed so often because Cuban intelligence was so good, they knew all the plots the second they were conceived. There are stories of Fidel waiting in a jungle airstrip in Cuba for an American assassin to secretly land there, and he would meet him at the airplane and say, "You here to kill me? Go, try it." He was there before they were there. They had infiltrated so many of these groups that there's no way we could have been successful.
Cuban agents, time and time again, capture Cuban exiles sent onto the island to conduct sabotage. The Cuban propaganda machine would whip up public fury about such attempts. The slogan was "Paredón," up against the wall. However, no reliable statistics exist on how many people were executed.
Yo participé en combatir 3 atentados. Uno de ellos dicen que eran de la CIA. Los otros 2 no dijeron que eran de la CIA. Y eran atentados posibles, o sea, que pudieran haber matado a Fidel. Pero fuera de eso, yo no te puedo decir si fueron más de 3. Claro, Cuba dice que son como 600, no, 700, una cosa así, es una barbaridad, eso no es posible.
There's a Castro math, if you will, in terms of when you look at even his own speeches. where he will say that he survived so many assassination attempts, and other regime officials will say, no, it was 700, almost 750. They can't even get the numbers straight.
Between assassination attempts and U.S.-sanctioned sabotage, the conflict between Cuba and the United States, between Castro and Kennedy, escalated even further. Castro threatened reprisals if the United States didn't stop their assassination attempts.
Fidel knew that Kennedy was trying to kill him. He said, the American leadership should know that if they continue to try to assassinate Cuban leaders, the same thing could happen to them.
In addition to covert operations, President Kennedy also applied economic pressure. The United States extended their embargo against Cuba, from just banning weapons sales to include nearly all commercial enterprise. Minister of Industry Che Guevara set out once more to inspire the Cuban people to work harder to make up for the embargo. President Kennedy, however, made one exception for himself. The day before the embargo went into effect, he had an aide buy every box of his favorite Cuban cigars to be had in Washington, D.C.
Cuba es un país pobre. Siempre lo ha sido y siempre lo será. El problema del embargo es muy lógico. Si tú le intervienes a un país todas sus empresas, como hizo Fidel con las empresas americanas, que yo no sé cuántos miles de millones son, pues claro que tienen que reaccionar, por supuesto. Ahora bien, ese embargo es entre comillas, porque si Cuba tiene dólares, compra donde quiera.
The main effect the embargo had was to restrict Cuba's access to the American banking system. Thus, trade with American companies came to a halt. The rest of the world, and especially the socialist Warsaw Pact partners, were not affected by the embargo. This meant that the embargo alone was not enough to bring down Fidel Castro. As instructed by President Kennedy, the U.S. military planned a new invasion. A full-size dry run of this was staged and filmed in 1962 in Puerto Rico. The operation was called Ortsac, Castro spelled backwards.
Fidel, y yo también lo pensé, venía una otra invasión, o qué posibilidad tenía Cuba de luchar contra eso, ninguna. Hubieran barrido la isla, la hubieran destrozado completa, no se hubiera rendido. Déjame decirte eso, en aquel momento, año 62, Cuba no se hubiera rendido, lo hubieran acabado con todo ello, y conmigo, inclusive.
He was afraid that the next time it wouldn't just be brave young Cubans from Miami intervening in Cuba. It was going to be the American military, American Rangers, and the airborne divisions. He was afraid he was going to be facing something that he knew would defeat him. And the only protection he conceived of, the only possible protection, was to have Soviet forces on the island defending him.
Fidel Castro sent his Minister for Industry, Ernesto Che Guevara, to Moscow. Officially, it was to negotiate new trade contracts. But, behind the scenes, Guevara made a military pact with Soviet Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev. Soviet nuclear missiles were to be installed in Cuba. They were to protect both the island and the Soviet Union. The United States had already installed nuclear missiles in Turkey, which could reach Moscow in a matter of minutes. The Soviet missiles were intended to be a countermeasure. As ordered by their General Secretary, the Soviet military leadership began to plan the operation in secret and issued deployment orders to a nuclear-armed division in the Ukraine.
В мае месяце 1962 года в дивизии пошел слух в штабе дивизии, что нас куда-то отправляют.
The soldiers were told that their deployment would take them to the city of Anadyr in remote Siberia. As no feasible land route connected the 43rd Guards Missile Division's home bases in the Ukraine with Anadyr, the deployment would be via ship. In May 1962, the division, along with all its equipment, was loaded in secret onto almost 300 commercial ships. They crossed the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Once they were in the Atlantic, the soldiers realized they were not going to Siberia after all, but to Cuba.
Мы действительно погрузили лыжи, полушубки, валенки, шапки. И когда мы прибыли в порты, различные порты Кубы, и начали разгружаться, кубинцы бегали и смотрели, что мы привезли, для чего мы полушубки привезли, для чего мы лыжи разгружаем.
The Soviet soldiers had brought far more than winter coats and skis to Cuba. Their cargo included 36 nuclear warheads, as well as missiles and bombers to deliver them to targets in the United States. U.S. spy planes discovered that Soviet shipments to Cuba had intensified, but not the reason behind this increase.
Сначала они начали облетывать наши корабли. Мы везли туда оборудование для автозавода. Вот так, легенда такая назвала, наш корабль. Другие корабли везли там сельхозоборудование, еще что-то. Колхозники ехали там. Вот выходишь, смотришь, уже на бреющем полете над кораблем американцы бороздят. Но мы сначала боялись их, а потом начали плевать на них.
Altogether, the Soviet Union deployed some 43,000 soldiers in Cuba in almost total secrecy. They set up a number of bases around the island. Along with their nuclear cargo, they also brought modern anti-aircraft weapons to defend themselves. The Cuban government, despite the secret nature of the operation, gave the Soviet troops a warm welcome.
Вот везде были развешаны плакаты «Никита», «Фидель», «Эмиго». И мы у себя тоже это развесили, такие лозунги, тоже их применяли. Кубинцы очень добрые, очень интересные люди. Они те последние дадут, но особенно вот к нам, как они относились. Они к нам относились как к братьям своим.
The Soviet missiles were to be made operational as soon as possible. Each of the 36 atomic warheads deployed to Cuba was equivalent to 50 times the power of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In September 1962, the deployment was completed. Most of the missiles were ready to launch. Until now, the U.S. government had only ascertained that the Soviet Union had military advisors in Cuba. The nuclear threat, however, remained unknown.
The Soviets looked at Kennedy as a young, naive, didn't know what the hell he was doing in the world. He says, okay, we'll put some missiles in there and we'll show him.
On September 13, 1962, President Kennedy held a press conference. A journalist asked how the USA would react if Cuba had nuclear missiles.
This country will do whatever must be done to protect its own security.
It was a gamble by Khrushchev. His plan and his hope was that they could get the missiles into Cuba secretly, without the Americans knowing, that they could get them up and running, they could become operational. And then Khrushchev planned to travel to Cuba and to, with Castro, I guess, at his side, to announce to the world, but to the Americans, we are now at a position of nuclear parity with you.
But shortly before Khrushchev's visit, an American spy plane photographed a missile site in Cuba. The next day, President Kennedy was shown the photo. At that point, neither he nor his advisors knew the missiles were operational. JFK had to face the most difficult decision of his presidency to date.
Kennedy met with his group of advisors. It was called the Executive Committee, the ExComm. And Kennedy met with them on the morning of October 16th in the White House. And that's when most of these men found out that the Soviets, in fact, in collusion with the Cubans, were in the process of developing nuclear weapons facilities in Cuba.
Once he saw that the Russians had introduced nuclear missiles into Cuba, he decided that the security of the United States was at stake, that this would change the balance of power, that all of the defenses of the U.S. were oriented toward the Soviet Union. Now they had to be oriented toward Cuba.
Kennedy's advisors proposed a conflicting range of options. His generals demanded an immediate invasion of Cuba, or at least the bombardment of the missile sites, preferably without a declaration of war to guarantee the surprise effect. A naval blockade was also mentioned as a less aggressive solution to stop further military deliveries. But, according to international law, a blockade, too, was an act of war. JFK's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was opposed to this. He thought no action should be taken. He believed the missiles were not yet operational and, in any case, were not the Soviet Union's only nuclear threat against the United States.
It was a moment when it could have been world atomic war. And Robert Kennedy said, can we do to Cuba what Japan did to us at Pearl Harbor? And can we live with that?
American intelligence reports soon showed that the Soviets had deployed their tried and tested medium-range missiles on Cuba. This would allow them to hit most targets in the continental U.S. with a degree of accuracy that would be impossible with their new and yet untested long-range missiles based in the Soviet Union itself. Even with this apparent threat, Kennedy did not want to risk war. But from a political point of view, his back was against the wall. 1 month previously, he had promised an intervention if such circumstances arose. Numerous influential senators and government officials also demanded an immediate attack on Cuba, but Kennedy hesitated. On October 22, 1962, Fidel Castro received an official visitor from North Africa. The president of Algeria and Fidel Castro paraded in the streets of Havana. Together, they demanded a worldwide ban on nuclear weapons. Not a word was said about the Soviet Union's missiles in Cuba.
Fidel estaba dispuesto a inmolarse en ese momento, porque Fidel es megalómano, que eso es lo que no se entiende muy bien a veces. Él prefería morirse siendo el superhéroe de Latinoamérica que vivir siendo...
The same day, Kennedy made the crisis official in a television broadcast.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
The news shocked many Cubans. The army prepared to defend the homeland. Fear of war spread rapidly.
Era solo un niño. Bueno, ni mi mamá ni mi papá estaban en la casa. Y mi padre en ese momento estaba movilizado por la crisis de octubre. Incluso él después participa en los interrogatorios a los prisioneros que se hacen allí. Y yo lo que recuerdo, sí, ese clima de guerra, ese no saber muy bien.
In order to protect their nuclear missiles, the Soviet Army had installed its most advanced anti-aircraft defenses. Their orders were clear. They could only return fire if America attacked.
Конечно, сказать, чем руководствовались руководители военные Соединенных Штатов Америки, когда посылали в день по 7-10 вылетов самолетов над Кубой было. Они понимали, что мы их трогать пока не будем. У нас было чем сбивать.
But the Americans' reconnaissance flights now confirmed that the missiles were operational. Kennedy placed the U.S. nuclear forces on DEFCON 2, the second highest alert. Khrushchev, meanwhile, ordered his ships to ignore the American quarantine. The world was on the brink of nuclear war.
Один раз нервы не выдержали. У генерала Гречка был такой военачальник войск ПВО, который там был. И по его команде мы сбили американский самолет один. Ожидали, что после этого будут очень серьезные последствия.
An American plane was shot down and the pilot was killed. The U.S. and Soviet governments accused one another of wanting to start a war. Behind the scenes, American and Soviet diplomats were working hard to find a solution to the crisis. Fidel Castro soon learned of these back-channel talks. He felt betrayed that the great powers were negotiating without him.
Ni bajo esa bandera ni bajo ninguna otra podrá venir nadie a inspeccionar nuestro país. Nosotros sabemos.
Castro told Khrushchev, if the Americans intervene, if they do a military intervention in Cuba, you should not wait for them to attack you. As soon as they intervene in Cuba, you should unleash the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal against American targets. Apocalypse.
Sirens, air raid shelters, gas masks. The world prepared for an inevitable nuclear war.
Ich kann mich sehr gut erinnern, wie ganz einfache Menschen Angst hatten vor einem Krieg, weil Kennedy hatte ja selbst mit dem Einsatz von Atomwaffen gedroht. Das darf man ja heute alles nicht verkleinern. Und ja, Khrushchev war auch ein Hitzkopf.
On October 27, 1962, Soviet Prime Minister Khrushchev proposed a deal to President Kennedy. He was prepared to withdraw his nuclear missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the USA would lift the quarantine and promise never to invade Cuba. The USA also had to withdraw its missiles from Turkey, but was allowed to keep this part of the agreement secret. Kennedy accepted the deal. The threat of nuclear war was over, but Fidel Castro felt he had lost out.
Мы согласились вывести ракеты с острова Свободы, с Кубы. Это не очень понравилось Фиделю и вообще кубинскому народу. Как привезли ракеты, а потом вдруг обратно их увозите?
Castro, dans son jeune élan révolutionnaire bouillonnant, a dit plus tard, il l'a dit, qu'au fond, Khrouchtchev il a même dit que c'était une pédale, hein, excusez-moi, je crois que c'est des termes aujourd'hui qu'on n'a plus le droit de dire, mais il l'a dit, maricón, hein, c'est le terme espagnol.
In order to appease Fidel Castro after the missiles were removed, Khrushchev invited him to the Soviet Union on an official visit in the summer of 1963. The Cuban leader was given a rousing welcome, like no other statesman before him. Castro traveled around the Soviet Union, from Moscow to Leningrad to the remote steppes of southern Russia and distant Siberia. Castro was showered with presents, including traditional tribal clothing and even a baby bear. Everywhere he went, the propaganda cameras were there to film him. The vodka flowed, and honors rained down.
Фидель был награжден званием Героя Советского Союза с вручением ордена Ленина и золотой медали, золотая звезда. Он был награжден грамотой почетного доктора наук Московского университета. Вообще поездка была тогда триумфальной, и удалось Хрущеву смазать вот это негативное впечатление о себе, которое осталось. А отношения вообще были очень сердечные.
Hero of the Soviet Union was the highest order the country could bestow. As a show of both acquiescence and defiance, Fidel would go on to wear it proudly for many years, but only when meeting with Soviet officials. 1 year later, it was the industry minister Ernesto Che Guevara's turn to be invited to the Soviet Union. He thought Khrushchev had been mistaken to back down during the missile crisis. Guevara dreamed of worldwide revolution, not of realpolitik.
très curieusement, il y a là une grosse différence d'interprétation. Guevara pensant que les soviétiques sont quand même pas les types parfaits qu'on pourrait espérer de la part de révolutionnaires qui n'aident pas assez le tiers-monde.
U.S. President Kennedy, meanwhile, sought to free the Cuban exiles still in prison on the island after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Castro was willing to let them go for a steep price.
Castro le puso a cada uno de los prisioneros, lo que ellos consideraban el lumpen, los pusieron un precio de $25,000. La clase media le pusieron, de acuerdo con ellos otra vez, le pusieron un precio de $50,000. Los señores más ricos le pusieron un precio de $100,000 y por la cabeza de cada uno de ellos, y los tres principales de la brigada le pusieron un precio de $500,000 a cada uno de ellos.
After sending over $53 million worth of food and medicine to Cuba, the remaining members of Brigade 2506 were allowed to return to the United States, where they were welcomed by President Kennedy on December 29, 1962.
I believe that at the Orange Bowl, when he received our flag in custody, and he promised to return that flag very soon in a free Cuba, that's when he did sign his death sentence. And he did meant it. He opened the Armed Forces of the United States for the brigade. The idea was to use us in a new invasion of Cuba.
Despite this promise, however, Kennedy did not authorize further invasion plans for Cuba. Instead, he tried to explore ways for the U.S. to coexist with Cuba under Fidel Castro, but it was complicated without official diplomatic relations. Kennedy heard about the imminent visit to Cuba by a French journalist.
Il s'est assis à ce fameux bureau de la Ovale. J'étais en face, à la fois fasciné et intimidé. Et tout de suite, ça a été, alors il m'a dit, alors vous partez pour Cuba, on m'a dit. J'ai dit oui.
President Kennedy saw Jean Daniel as an opportunity to send Fidel Castro a message.
Il me dit, vous savez, ce qu'il faut bien comprendre, ce que Castro ne saisit pas, mais surtout les Américains, c'est que moi, le communisme, ce n'est pas mon ennemi, je m'en fiche. Je ne suis pas communiste, bien sûr. Mais moi, les rapports de Castro avec les communistes, ça m'est égal. Ce qui m'intéresse, c'est quoi? C'est la guerre et la paix.
The next day, Jean Daniel flew to Havana. But on arrival, he found out that his interview with Fidel Castro was postponed. It would be weeks before he could meet the Cuban leader. On November 20th, 1963, Fidel Castro suddenly showed up at the journalist's hotel. He was aware of Daniel's meeting with Kennedy.
Là, nous sommes en face et je vois un Castro incroyablement amateur de la moindre réflexion. Chaque fois, il me disait, mais comment il vous l'a dit ça? Il insistait sur ce que vous dites. Et comment il m'appelait? Qu'est-ce qu'il vous disait de moi?
The conversation went on until dawn. The Frenchman had the feeling Castro could be interested in a deal with Kennedy. The two men met again the next day.
Au moment où on sert l'immense plateau de fruits de mer, il y a le téléphone se retentit et c'est le président d'Ortikos qui l'appelle, le président de la République, et lui qui dit Herido, blessé, gravement, oui, très gravement, oui. Vous m'appelez? Et il dit, il raccroche et il nous dit, c'est très grave. Et la première phrase qu'il me dit en me regardant, on va dire que c'était nous. On va dire que c'est nous.
It was the 22nd of November, 1963. President Kennedy was on an official visit to Dallas, Texas. At 12:30, gunshots rang out. John F. Kennedy was fatally wounded. The shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, had been in contact with the Cuban embassy in Mexico.
He basically told
the embassy personnel, who were really Cuban intelligence, that he'd kill Kennedy for the revolution because he knew Kennedy was coming to Texas. And he said, his exact words were, I'll kill that bastard Kennedy.
Oswald had lived in the Soviet Union for more than 2 years. He was a political agitator more than a hitman. Whatever chances there may have been to ease tensions between Castro and Kennedy, none exist under Kennedy's successor, Johnson. Cuba and the United States were and would remain sworn enemies. On December 11th, 1964, Ernesto Che Guevara reiterated this in a speech at the United Nations, but his criticism extended both to the U.S. and the Soviet Union, whom he saw as having strayed from the course of world revolution.
Guevara commence à avoir son opposition avec Castro sur le thème de savoir si l'Union soviétique est bel et bien, comment dirais-je, très différente dans son impérialisme que l'impérialisme américain.
El Che Guevara es como decimos nosotros en el argot cubano, era un árbol que le estaba haciendo mucha sombra a Fidel. El Che Guevara fue un hombre que empezó a explicar y empezó a ver qué cosa era el comunismo en la práctica.
On February 24th, 1965, Guevara attended a conference in Algiers. He again severely criticized the Soviet Union and called for global revolution. It would be his last public speech. On returning to Cuba, Guevara was coolly welcomed by Fidel Castro and Cuban President Dorothy Cos.
Se fueron a un lugar, a una casa, una reunión que tuvieron ahí que duró unas 40, 42 horas. Cuando se salió de ahí, ya el Che no era comandante, ya el Che no era ministro, ya el Che prácticamente no era nada.
After resigning from office, Che Guevara simply disappeared. For months, no one knew where he was. When asked about his comrade and former second man, Castro said that Guevara would reappear when he was ready. In secret, Che Guevara continued to work on spreading revolutionary ideas, particularly in the Third World, and above all, in Africa. He envisioned many small-scale revolutions, aimed at drawing the U.S. and its allies into wars that they could not win. Guevara's first objective was the Congo, where he wanted to support the Simba, a communist rebel group.
La idea del Congo responde a una concepción del Che de que la guerra había que desarrollarla en varios frentes. ¿Entiendes? Tenía la experiencia de la Sierra Maestra, la experiencia de Fidel, como Fidel en Cuba creó varios frentes y obligó al enemigo también a distribuir su fuerza.
Y ahí está lo del Che, cuando dice 1, 2, 3, mucho Vietnam. Una consigna revolucionaria de un momento histórico inolvidable.
But Guevara's revolutionaries in the Congo came up against serious difficulties. The rebels willingly accepted the weapons he had brought from Cuba, but they were wary of Guevara as he was not Congolese. And he in turn underestimated the complexity of the tribal rivalries that divided the rebel groups.
Fidel Castro sabía perfectamente que era muy difícil que alguno de esos movimientos guerrilleros lograra el triunfo, porque se partía de una mala lectura, una falsa interpretación de la Revolución Cubana. Es decir, que con unos pocos hombres con mucha voluntad en la montaña o con actividades militares en las ciudades se podía tener el poder.
Disease and fierce fighting decimated Guevara's revolutionaries. In November 1965, only 6 out of 12 men were left alive.
Cuando el Che sale del África, él sale muy enfermo. Entonces él no fue para Cuba, él fue para Praga, Checoslovaquia. Hay un lugar que se llama Carlos Di Bari. Ahí en Carlos Di Bari, en Checoslovaquia, ahí se quedó un médico cubano con él ahí porque él no quiso regresar a Cuba.
An emissary from Fidel Castro finally managed to persuade Guevara to return to Cuba. Once back, he immediately turned his sights on the next country where he could stage a revolution, Bolivia. This poor South American country, he reasoned, would be fertile ground for revolution. And once this happened, the United States would have to intervene, triggering a popular uprising. On November 11th, 1966, Ernesto Che Guevara flew to La Paz under a false identity. He was accompanied by a veteran team of Cuban revolutionaries.
Una de nuestras materias principales era estudiar el quechua para podernos comunicar con los indios en la zona. Cuando llegamos a Bolivia, o sea, Fidel nos había hecho muchas promesas de todo lo que se había creado para buscar una seguridad a nuestra estadía en Bolivia. Él sí nos había dicho que íbamos a una lucha de 10 a 15 años por lo menos, porque había que liberar América del Sur.
Fidel Castro promised the support of the Bolivian Communist Party, but the party did not want a civil war. The Soviet Union, too, declined all aid. In the end, Guevara was forced to move his rebel group into the remote jungle. Here again, the guerrilleros received no support. And the local population did not even speak Quechua, the language they had learned.
Cuando llegamos a Bolivia, el 95% de las cosas que Fidel nos había prometido habían desaparecido. Lo primero, ya no íbamos al territorio del Alto Beni. De una forma mágica se había cambiado el territorio.
Despite everything, Che Guevara ordered attacks against the Bolivian army. His men succeeded in winning several skirmishes. When the Bolivian president learned who he was dealing with in the Andes, he asked for help from the United States. Guevara's plan to provoke a U.S. invasion seemed to be working.
Well, in 1967, the CIA believed that Che Guevara had been killed in Africa. Until the day that they captured in Bolivia Regis Libre, the French journalist, and Ciro Busto, Argentinian newspaper guy. And they were the one who confirmed that Che Guevara was in Bolivia. Once that was confirmed, and of course the Bolivian army had very little training in anti-guerrilla operation, they had no expertise whatsoever, that's when immediately they sent a special forces unit from Panama.
But the United States did not send troops, only CIA agents. They assisted the Bolivian army in tracking down Guevara's group. On October 8, 1967, they closed in on their target. 1,800 Bolivian soldiers surrounded the guerrilleros. Che was wounded in the leg and taken prisoner. Guevara was interrogated by Felix Rodriguez, a CIA agent, Cuban exile, and the veteran of the Bay of Pigs invasion.
So I stood in front of him and said, Che Guevara, I'd like to talk to you. And he looked to me very arrogant and said, nobody talks to me, nobody interrogates me. So I looked at him and said, Commander, I didn't come here to interrogate you. Our ideals are different, but I admire you. You used to be a head of a state in Cuba and you're like this because you believe in your ideals, even though I know they are mistaken. I just came here to talk to you. So he looked to me for about 30 seconds, 45 seconds to see I would laugh. When he saw that I was serious, he said, can you untie me? Can I sit? So I asked for a soldier from the outside to come in and I told him, untie Commander Guevara. He looked at me and said, untie Commander Guevara. So he went down, he untied him, and we got a little bench that was there, and we sat him in there. It was kind of hard because he had been tied down in the fort for a long time, so it was hard for him to stretch and be able to. But we sat him there, and then we started talking.
Felix Rodriguez claims that his mission was to ensure Guevara's survival. The CIA was aware of the divisions between Che and Fidel Castro and wanted to exploit it. but the Bolivian president, in overall command of the operation, ordered Guevara executed.
So I look at him and say, is anything you want for your family, if I can pass the message? So I will say in a sarcastic way, he said, well, if you can tell Fidel, he will soon see a triumphant revolution in America. And then he changed the expression and saying, if you can tell my wife to remarry and try to be happy. He approached me, we shook hands. It didn't seem like the wound in his leg seemed to bother him anymore. We shook hands, then we embraced, and then he stood in attention thinking I was going to be the one to shoot him. And I left the room. Sergeant Terra and Mario Terán were right next to Lieutenant Perez. And I looked at him and said, look, this order from your high command to eliminate the prisoner. Don't shoot from here up, shoot from here down, because he's supposed to die from combat wound.
On October 9th, 1967, Che Guevara was executed by a Bolivian soldier. 9 days later, on October the 18th, Cuban television announced the news. Fidel Castro made a martyr out of his former revolutionary companion. The children of Cuba, he said, should strive to be like Che.